Good morning, Garden Oaks family. So good to see you this morning. Hey, if you're new with us and I've had a chance to meet you, my name is John. I'm one of the pastors, and we're especially glad that you are here with us. If you are new with us this morning, you picked a great day to show up, hopefully a great day to show up, because we're starting a new sermon series this morning. We're starting a series walking through the book of Mark. And so whether you're new or old or been with us a while, kind of give you a heads up on where we are going. We're going to spend the majority of the next year or so walking through the entirety of the book of Mark. We'll spend about 36 weeks out of the next year walking through this book. We'll wrap it up next Easter. In the middle of that, we'll be taking some breaks to talk about some different things. So we'll take a break in the summer and talk about parenting from a biblical perspective, like what kind of hope and encouragement does the Bible give us in this just like roller coaster up and down journey of parenting. We'll be talking about that. We'll be taking some other breaks to talk about some other stuff. But again, for the majority of the next year, we are going to be digging into the book of Mark. So real quick, some background to Mark. If you are new to the Bible, if the Bible's new to you, first of all, hey, thanks for being here. We're so glad you are here as you kind of explore this journey of faith. We are glad to do that with you. But if you're new to the Bible, Mark is one of what are called the four Gospels. In the New Testament, there's basically four different sort of biographies of the life and ministry of Jesus. So you've got Matthew, Mark, which we're going to be looking at today, Luke, and then John. So four different biographies of the life of Jesus. They're written by four different people. They're written to different audiences. Each of them kind of has a different purpose and intent and focus as they set out in their writings. And so of the four Gospels, though, something that I think is kind of sad is I think Mark oftentimes gets overlooked. It's kind of sort of the last one that people kind of dig in and read. A lot of people read Matthew because as you're kind of turning and flipping through the Bible, you get to the New Testament, Matthew comes first, so a lot of people start there. You've got the Gospel of Luke. Luke is the longest of the four Gospels, so it's got the most content, it's got the most information and detail in it, so a lot of people go there. John was kind of like a hipster of the first century, so he's the guy, like, his writing is very like artistic and poetic and beautiful, so a lot of people enjoy that and start with John. And so because of that, like, most people just kind of gloss over and skip over Mark. But I think that's unfortunate. Mark has become, I think, my favorite of the four Gospels. And the reason I love Mark so much personally is because Mark is short, it's action-packed, and it's fast-paced. Like, it just gets in, gets to the point, it starts in, and doesn't keep you waiting or wondering. Like, for me personally, I'm sure it has to do with like phones and technology and social media, but I already had ADD as a kid. And so now with all this other stuff, my attention span is just like even smaller and smaller. So I'm the type of person where if I'm going to watch a new show or if I'm going to start a new movie that I haven't seen, like, there's just so much new content out there. So if I'm going to try something new, like, you've got to start with something compelling. You've got to suck me in quick or else I'm going to move on to the next thing. Right? Sometimes people will say, hey, there's this new show. It's amazing. You've got to check it out. Just be warned, like, the first 7 episodes are all character development. So just get through the first 7 episodes, and then by the 8th episode, like, it gets to the story, and then it's awesome and exciting, and the payoff is great. And I'm like, no. Like, I'm not going to spend 7 episodes of a show waiting for something to happen. Like, you've got to show me something exciting or something compelling, or else I'm moving on to the next thing. And so if you're like me in that way, if you're maybe a little ADD, your attention span is small, like, you need to get sucked into a story or else you're going to move on. If that's you, then the Gospel of Mark is the one for you. Because again, like I said, it's fast-paced, it's action-oriented, it just starts in and it doesn't stop for the entire book. And the reason is because as Mark sets out to write this kind of narrative account of the life and ministry of Jesus, what Mark is setting out to do, his kind of purpose, his intention, his goal, is to prove to you and me who he believes Jesus is by the things that Jesus did. So in a lot of the other Gospels contain a lot of the teachings of Jesus, because those authors at times, they're concerned with the things that Jesus taught. In Mark, it's not that he is not concerned with the things that Jesus taught. Jesus is God, so what he teaches is incredibly important. It's just that his goal is not to prove who Jesus is by the things Jesus taught. Mark's goal is to prove who Jesus is by the things that Jesus did. So again, Mark just like starts in, gets to the point. In just the first chapter of this book, We're going to see Jesus get baptized. We're going to see Jesus go out into the wilderness and basically battle against Satan. We're going to see Jesus casting demons out of people. We're going to see Jesus healing people of diseases. Like, all that is just in the first chapter of the book. So Mark gets going and he doesn't stop until the very end. So I'm excited to dig in. Now, one other bit of context for Mark, if you're new to it. Mark, as you probably guessed, it's written by a guy named Mark, or John Mark is his full name. But Mark was not one of the 12 disciples. He was not one of the first followers of Jesus. In fact, Mark was a kid. He was a child during the ministry of Jesus. But what we know about him is that Mark's mother was a woman named Mary. And there's lots of Marys in the New Testament, so it gets very confusing. But Mark's mother was a woman named Mary, and she was one of the first disciples. She was one of the first followers of Jesus. And so the book of Acts actually tells us that the early church in Jerusalem, after Jesus' resurrection, the early church actually met in Mary, and thus Mark's home. She was one of the leaders of the early church. And what scholars guess is that it is most likely that the Last Supper, which was this kind of last meal, this final meal that Jesus and his disciples shared together before his arrest and crucifixion, most scholars believe that that Last Supper actually happened in Mary and thus Mark's home. So Mark was a guy who, as a child, he would have spent a lot of time around Jesus and a lot of time around the disciples. But here's what you need to know as we kind of dig in and begin studying through Mark. When Mark is writing, he's giving this detailed account of the life of Jesus. Mark is not writing his own eyewitness account of Jesus, because again, he was a child for a lot of this time. What Mark is doing is Mark is actually writing Peter's eyewitness account of Jesus. Because Mark and Peter would later on become very close. They became partners in ministry. Peter would actually call Mark his own son. And Mark would become Peter's translator or interpreter. So when Mark is writing, what he's doing is he's really transcribing and writing Peter's account of the life and ministry of Jesus. So that's kind of an introduction to the book of Mark. And so, man, I think we're going to have a lot of fun walking through it over the next year or so. But real quick, before we get into Mark, we got to start much earlier in the Bible. We need to do a couple minutes of biblical theology real quick. Is that okay? You guys good with that? All right, cool, awesome. One person shaking their head yes, so we'll do it anyway. All right, so what the Bible shows us, the Bible starts out in the book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible. And in the first book of the Bible, the very first verse of the Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." All right, that's how the story of the Bible starts. In the very beginning, it says God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on, and what it shows us is that God creates this good and this beautiful and this perfect world. Everything is great, everything is perfect, everything is beautiful. And in this good, perfect, beautiful world, as sort of the pinnacle of creation, as the masterpiece of creation, God creates human beings. Human beings are kind of the masterpiece. They are the pinnacle of all of God's creation. And God says, when he created humans, he says, "I am creating them in my own image." It tells us human beings are the only things in all of creation that God makes in his image. And so real quick, to the side, that means a ton of different things, but one of the things that means is that whoever you are, whether you believe in God or not, whether you consider yourself a follower of Jesus or not, whoever you are, the Bible says you were made in God's image, which means you have infinite value and worth. Right? That means that no matter what you think about yourself, no matter what people at work think about you, no matter what people at school, no matter what your parents or family think about you, regardless of any of that, God says he has created you in his image. You are loved, you matter, your life has infinitely more worth than you could ever imagine. So the story of Genesis tells us God creates this beautiful, good world as sort of the pinnacle of that creation. He makes human beings in his image and he places them in that good world. And God's intention was that human beings would live forever, that we would never die. And that forever we would live with God in this perfect world, in this perfect paradise, enjoying the presence of our Creator and his creation forever. That was God's design. That's how the story of the Bible opens. But if you've read the Bible past the first page or two, you know that very quickly something goes wrong. You know that the first humans, they reject God, and sin and evil invade God's good creation. And when that happens, everything is broken. So human beings, our relationship to God is broken. Our relationship to one another is broken. Nature is broken. Death and chaos invade God's good creation and God's good world. But from the very beginning, God promised that he would do something to one day fix that brokenness. From the time sin and death and chaos invade God's good world, God makes a promise that one day he's going to do something about it. He won't let death and chaos reign forever. One day he will bring healing to that brokenness. So you fast forward many, many years, and later on, living in Israel, there's this prophet, this guy named Isaiah. And as a prophet, occasionally Isaiah would actually speak on behalf of God. And Isaiah, speaking on behalf of God in Isaiah chapter 65, he talks about this day that will one day come where God fixes all the brokenness in the world. So before we get to Mark, I want to read this from Isaiah 65. It will be on the screen, so follow along and pay attention to what Isaiah the prophet says will happen. He's speaking on behalf of God, so this is basically coming from God, Isaiah 65:17. God says, "Look, I am creating a new heavens and a new earth." Right, so remember, the Bible begins by, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created it good, but it was broken. So now God is saying, look, I am creating a new heavens and a new earth, and no one will even think about the old ones anymore. Be glad, rejoice forever in my creation, and look, I will create Jerusalem as a place of happiness. Her people will be a source of joy. I will rejoice over Jerusalem and delight in my people. Listen to this. He says, and the sound of weeping and crying will be heard no more. All the brokenness, all the pain, all the sorrow in the world is gone. And then God says, no longer will babies die when only a few days old. No longer will adults die before they have lived a full life. No longer will people be considered old at 100. Only the cursed will die that young. In those days, people will live in the houses they built and eat the fruit of their own vineyards. Unlike the past, invaders will not take their houses and confiscate their vineyards. For my people will live as long as trees. That's an ancient way of saying that you will never die. You'll be eternal. And my chosen ones will have time to enjoy their hard-won gains. They will not work in vain, and their children will not be doomed to misfortune. For they are the people blessed by God, and their children too will be blessed. I will answer them before they even call to me. While they are still talking about their needs, I will go ahead and answer their prayers. So that brokenness between us and God is now healed. There is no divide in the relationship between us and God. And here he's talking about how nature will even be restored. He says, the wolf and the lamb will feed together. There won't be chaos and death and destruction all over nature. The lion will eat hay like a cow, but the snakes will eat dust. I think that's the Bible saying that there won't be snakes in heaven, which for me is amazing because I'm terrified of snakes. Now, I don't know if that's actually what that means. I think that's more allegory or something, but I'm gonna believe it's true. I'm gonna believe there's no snakes in heaven. The snakes will eat dust. In those days, no one will be hurt or destroyed on my holy mountain, for I, the Lord, have spoken. In that day, no one will be hurt. No one will be destroyed. Say, no one will die. So again, Isaiah, what he's saying here, he's saying, hey, in the beginning, God has made the heavens and the earth. But as we all know, because we all have eyes and we can all look around, heaven and earth are broken. There's chaos, there's destruction all around. And so what Isaiah the prophet says is that God will usher in a new beginning. One day, God will usher in a new heavens and a new earth that will never experience that brokenness. So, that's the promise. Right? That's the hope. That one day, God will bring a new beginning, a new creation, a new heavens and a new earth, and we will not experience brokenness any longer. That's the promise of the Old Testament. All right, so with that in mind, we'll jump into the book of Mark. This morning, we're just going to be looking at the very first verse of Mark because the first verse is basically Mark's thesis. It's basically Mark's summary of where he's going. So you know those like movies or TV shows where the opening scene, it kind of does a flash forward and it shows you like a scene or a clip from the ending of the movie. It shows you where everything's going, shows you the ending, but then it kind of rewinds and retraces its steps and shows you how it gets to that point. That's basically what Mark does here. The very first verse is basically the ending. He gives you the conclusion. He tells you right off the bat where he is going, and then he's going to spend the rest of the book kind of unpacking that and showing how he came to that conclusion. So Mark chapter 1, verse 1, this is what he writes. He says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, if you're anything like me, what I do is if I'm like kind of just like sitting there having my coffee, reading my Bible, a verse like that is a verse that I typically just kind of like pass over and don't really spend a lot of time thinking about. Because it just sounds kind of like introductory remarks. It sounds like Mark's not really making any big claims or statements here. But when you dive in, when you stop and pause and really look at what Mark is saying here, the claims that he is making are incredibly charged. So he starts off in his letter and he says the beginning. So we'll come back to that in a moment because that's actually really important. He says the beginning of the gospel or of the good news, depending on what English translation you're reading. He starts out the beginning of the good news or the beginning of the gospel. Now, that word in our English, gospel or good news, it's a Greek word, euangelion, and it was originally a word that was actually used during times of war. So here's kind of the origin of that word, euangelion, which we translate gospel or good news. What would happen? Imagine, thousands of years ago, you were living in an ancient city somewhere. It's one of these cities like you see in the movies. It's got, kind of walls all around the city. So you're living there in your city, but you hear there's an enemy army coming to invade your city. So one day your king, he calls his army up, and you see them marching out of the gates to go to war to defend you and your people. And so for the next several days or weeks or maybe even months, every moment you are filled with a little bit of fear, you're filled with a little bit of anxiety because you have no idea if at any moment your king is going to march back through those gates victorious and you'll be safe, or will it be the enemy king that marches back through those gates, in which case you're either going to be killed or taken as a slave for the rest of your life. So every day you're in panic, you're in fear, you have anxiety, not knowing what's going to happen. So what would happen is if, fortunately, your king and his army, if they were victorious, if they won the battle, what the king would do is he would send a herald or he would send a messenger back to the city ahead of the army to bring the euangelion, or to bring the gospel, to bring the good news. So that messenger would rush back as fast as possible to come back to the city and say, hey guys, listen up, our king has done it. He's won the battle. They have been victorious. There's nothing to worry about. We will continue to live. Right? That herald, the message he carried, it was called the euangelion, the gospel, the good news. So here, when Mark says the beginning of the good news, when he uses that word euangelion, good news, he's not talking about good news like in the same way, remember the Geico commercials where it's like, hey, good news, I just saved a bunch of money on my car insurance. Now, is that technically good news? Yes, that's good news. But that's the kind of good news, like you hear it and you're like, great, I saved a few bucks on my insurance, and then you finish going about your day and forget about it. Right? That's not the kind of good news Mark is talking about. When he uses that word, his audience would understand, no, this is a kind of good news that when you hear it, it changes everything. It's the kind of good news that brings light and peace and joy to the darkest fears and worries and anxieties that you are feeling. It's a kind of good news that you can't avoid. It changes everything. It's kind of like this. So my wife, Christy, she's not here today. She's at home actually recovering from surgery. She's all good, so no worries. You're just dealing with pain. So if you want to pray for her about that, I'm sure she would appreciate it. But she had to have surgery this week to remove a non-cancerous, a benign mass from her thyroid. So again, everything's good, like nothing to worry about. But the way this whole thing started was back in January. We were just like, I think it was a Sunday night. We were sitting there watching TV as a family, and like we noticed there was like a huge growth in her neck. We're like, that's odd. That doesn't seem like a great thing. So she went to the primary care doctor. The primary care doctor is like, yeah, let's get an ultrasound. Let's just make sure this thing is not cancerous. So sent her for the ultrasound. And, the ultrasound can't tell you if a growth is cancerous. But what the ultrasound will tell you is it will look at the size and the consistency of the growth, and it will tell you if it's likely cancerous or not. So get the ultrasound, and a day or two later, we get the results, and, on the results, it's basically a scale of, like it's not likely to be cancer at all. It's kind of maybe likely to be cancer, like all the way to like it's basically most likely cancerous. So we open up the results, we look at this, and because of the size and the consistency of this growth, it says highly suspicious to be cancerous. And so then the doctor refers us for a biopsy, and in my mind, I'm ignorant of all this stuff. So in my mind, whenever you throw out the cancer word, I'm assuming, man, things are going to move quick. Like, we'll get the biopsy tomorrow, they'll rush the results, we'll have that the next day, and know what we're dealing with. That's not apparently how the things work. All right, well, we call to schedule the biopsy. The soonest we can get in for the biopsy is a week and a half. Wait a week and a half, get the biopsy. After that, it takes another 2 weeks to get the results of the biopsy. So for somebody like me who's already prone to worry, already doomsday in my mind, already prone to anxiety, it was a month of hell. A month of waiting just with that constant pit in my stomach. A month of the only information that I had was that ultrasound results that said highly suspicious of cancer. So in my mind, for a month, my wife has cancer, and there's nothing I can do about it. It was absolutely awful. And so, man, I will never probably for the rest of my life forget when the results finally come in and we're sitting there with the doctor, and she opens up the results and she reads it, and she said, okay, the growth is benign, it's not cancerous. I could literally feel a weight come off my shoulders. I could feel my actual posture change. I could feel my lungs filling with air once again. That pit that was in my stomach turned to joy. It was a kind of good news when the doctor said it's benign. That was a kind of good news that changed everything. Right? That wasn't I just saved a few bucks on my car insurance, so I'm excited and then I freaking out. No, it changed everything. It was a good news that brought light and peace into my darkest fears and anxieties. Right, so here, when Mark says the good news, understand that's the kind of good news that he's talking about. He is talking about a news that when you receive it, you can't ignore it. You can't avoid it. You can't receive it and just move on with your day because it's a news that is so good, everything from that moment on will be different forever. That's the kind of news that Mark is talking about here. Now, here's why Mark states that this news he's about to write about and tell us about, here's why it's such good news. Go back to the first word. He says, the beginning of the good news. He starts out the beginning of the good news. So Mark opens his letter, he opens his book in a very intentional and in a very specific kind of way. Right, remember, Mark is a good Jewish man. So Mark, he's grown up going to synagogue, grown up going to the temple, studying the scriptures. Mark knows the book of Genesis. He knows that the Bible, that the scriptures open with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He knows that. And by the way, in Genesis, the Hebrew word there for in the beginning, it's just one word. In the is not even in the Hebrew, it's just basically beginning. That's how it starts. Mark knows that. He knows that's how the Bible opens. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And being a good Jewish man, he knows the prophecies. He knows that Isaiah has prophesied on behalf of God that one day God would make a new heavens and a new earth, that there would be a new beginning where God fixes all the brokenness that we see all around us. So Mark very intentionally opens his letter by saying, beginning. Now again, in his language, in the Greek, it doesn't even say the. There's no the before it, and there's no of the after it. He just opens, beginning, good news. That's how Mark starts. Because what he's doing is he's wanting to take us back to Genesis 1:1. What he wants us to do when he says beginning, he wants your mind, it's kind of like a hyperlink, back in the ancient world. He wants you to go back to Genesis 1:1. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So what he's saying is, hey, what is about to happen, what I'm about to proclaim is just as big of a deal as what Genesis 1:1 says when God created the heavens and the earth. What Mark is literally doing here, he's making the audacious claim that the promise of the prophets for this new creation, this fixing of the brokenness in the world, he's claiming that that promise is about to begin to be fulfilled. That's his claim to start the book, right? That just like Genesis was the beginning, what he's about to say is the new beginning. That what he's about to write about, it is like the seed being planted of everything being made new. It's the beginning of everything that is wrong in the world being put back right. Or to borrow the language from Tolkien from Lord and the Rings, it's the beginning of everything sad in the world starting to come untrue. That's what Mark is saying is happening. That what he's about to write about, it's a new start, it's new creation coming, it is a new beginning. So, he then tells us how this new beginning, this new creation, how God is going to fulfill this promise to fix all the brokenness in the world. He says the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, who is not just a Messiah, not just a teacher, not just a prophet, but who is the Son of God. All right, Mark is making a big claim here. Like, he's calling Jesus the Son of God. That's a big enough claim in and of itself, but we don't even have time to get into that today. What Mark is saying is that new creation is coming, a new world is coming, redemption of all the brokenness that we experience is coming, but it is coming through Jesus. Notice here, this is so beautiful. Mark does not say the beginning of the teachings of Jesus. It's not how he starts his book. He doesn't start it by saying, hey, begin the beginning of the advice of Jesus. He doesn't say the beginning of the religious rules of Jesus. He doesn't start with any of that. He says the beginning of the euangelion, the beginning of the good news, the beginning of the gospel, basically the beginning of the victory of Jesus. That's how he begins. What Mark is saying here is that this new beginning, this new creation that God promised thousands of years ago, the redemption of the world, it's going to be earned, it's going to be secured by Jesus. That Jesus is the one who will bring that to us. That's Mark's claim. And so then Mark will go on for the rest of the book, and he will show us that Jesus does this by living a perfect life without sin, by going to the cross, dying in our place for our sin, but on the third day rising from death to defeat death and hell and the grave forever, and by doing so planting that seed of new creation into the ground. So, if we go back to that original meaning of that word euangelion or gospel, right? Think back to that story where you're living a couple thousand years ago, you're living in a city, your king and his army is off to war. And imagine that messenger, that herald comes back one day and they pronounce the good news, they pronounce the gospel that your king has won. I want us to think about this. When you receive that good news, what do you have to do to benefit from your king's victory? Absolutely nothing. He already won. The battle's over. There's nothing left for you to do. When the good news comes to your city, you don't have to do anything except celebrate that your king has won. Amen. Now think about this. If instead of the good news, if your king has lost, he's dead, your army's defeated, and that herald, that messenger comes back, what are they bringing? Not good news, they're bringing advice. They're going to say the king is dead, our army's defeated, the enemy is on the way, grab whatever weapons you can find and be ready to fight for your life. Right, that's advice, that's not good news. But with good news, it's the battle is over, you are safe, your king has secured your freedom. So all that's left for you to do is nothing. You just enjoy the victory of your king. If you want to receive the benefits of his victory, all you have to do is say, I want to live as a citizen of this city, and I want to live under the lordship of that victorious king. That is all you have to do. And it's the same with Jesus. Jesus has come to defeat our enemies of sin and death in order that one day when he comes again, and he will come again, when he comes again, he will bring a new perfect creation. That new creation, that new heavens and that new earth that Isaiah prophesied about thousands of years ago. Jesus will bring that with him, and God's people will live forever with God. Jesus has secured that. Jesus has fought the war. He has won the battle. He has earned that for us. And all we have to do to enjoy his victory is say, I want to live as a citizen of his kingdom, and I want to live under the lordship of King Jesus. So that's the good news that Mark is going to proclaim and that he is going to prove through the life of Jesus over the next several months as we walk through this book. Let's pray.